Hi, my name is Riley Allen. This is my review of Chapter 2 of Outlander titled The Standing Stones. So in the last chapter, Claire, our main character, met an old man named Mr. Crook. Now, Mr. Crook is, like her, a fan of botany. I think that's what it is. Botany, the study of plants and whatnot. So he offered to take her to a place and show her the local flora. And to his credit, he was very knowledgeable, telling her about the flowers and the medicinal values which they had, which would probably earned him some credit, considering Claire was a nurse in World War II, so would probably find that part more interesting to add on. Then he showed her the standing stones, which I think some standing stones. And they are very, apparently kind of, they're captivating to Claire, in the sense. And all she could think was, she starts thinking about the time she and Frank went to Stonehenge, because Frank's a historian. Of course he went to Stonehenge. And then she went to the vicar, Reverend Wakefield's house, where Frank and Reverend Wakefield are. She goes to sit in a chair because, she's getting in the long haul of them talk about history, which they both find interesting, but she does not. So she's getting Eddie ready for a long haul of mm-hms, uh-huhs, and that's interestings. But the chair is occupied by a sleeping boy. We learn that his name is Roger Wakefield, the adoptive son. He's Roger Mackenzie Wakefield. He was born Roger Mackenzie. His father was a pilot in World War II. Pilot in the war, was shot down. His mother was killed in the Blitz, which made Claire think about her Uncle Lamb, who was killed when he was given a lecture in the British Museum, and the British Museum was bombed. All she could think was, though, that he'd probably be pleased that the so-and-so whatever survived. So, yeah. So, we're introduced to her, and he's kind of a little plot point in a sense. We'll get to that in a second, though. They start talking about how Frank's ancestor, Jack Randall, was kind of not a very good dude. He had complaints aplenty, but nothing seemed to come of him, which they theorize was because he had a benefactor, a patron. Now, they mention that the punishment for senior officers back then was a bit different than modern time, or back then, or 1940s modern, but anyways. And that it's not so much that he wasn't punished, it's that the complaints just disappeared. So they theorize that the Duke of Sandringham is him. Claire is called away to Mrs. Graham, the housekeeper, and she proceeds to read the tea leaves and, read her palms. Miss Graham is a very funny, witty person. She talks about how she usually dresses up at the fair as a seer or whatever. And she says that while she does read the palms, a lot of what she does is just reading a person, stating that what it boiled down to for her was, if you look like a hoe, I'm gonna predict that you're gonna be with child by the end of the year. But she said it's a bit more tactful if you check for a ring first, and then tell them that you'll be married soon. God, I laughed when I was reading it. Then she reads Claire's palms, and she says that she has a broken line, which means that she both stays where she is and leaves. She has a husband, 2 husbands. Now, she assures Claire that it doesn't mean anything. It just means that if something were unfortunate to happen to Frank, that she wouldn't be one of the ones to wallow in grief. Or, she would allow herself to move on, which is okay, kind of comforts her. Trying to, there were some other things, but they, Then they kind of move back into the room, and they talk about the Duke of Sandringham and how he might be the patron of Jack Randall. Then they go on to mention that Claire notices Roger's genealogical chart, and Reverend Wakefield says he doesn't want Roger to forget where he came from. It's a long line, back to the 1600s. While he goes on to kind of lament that his own family didn't have such a storied history, and that they didn't have good record keeping, only being able to trace it back to the 1762. Then Frank and Claire have a nice conversation about children. And she mentions Roger and that there are a lot of war orphans that they could adopt. Now, Frank mentions that he doesn't want to adopt an orphan because he doesn't quite feel if they would fit in, which I suppose is kind of fair. Like, he doesn't know if they'd fit in. It might break up the marriage, like an outsider coming in. But to his credit, he didn't toss the idea away. He said, maybe I'll change my opinion. Which is like him saying, who knows? Maybe if the baby fever really hits, but we don't have a baby, I'll change my mind. But he says, we haven't stopped trying the normal way. Which, yeah, they have not. Over the course of this chapter, you realize that Frank and Claire have a very healthy sex life, which is good for them. She's going to make mention of the Standing Stones because she thinks Frank would have an interest in them, but she doesn't do it because next day they have a trip to the Loch Ness, where they hear a story about Mary Grant and Donald Dunn. I don't know if it's a true story. I didn't bother to look it up, but it was a nice story nonetheless. How Mary Grant's father forbade her from seeing Donald Dunn. And when she refused, he requested the gentleman way out, being executed by beheading instead of being hanged like a felon. And the reason her father didn't approve is because he took part in the honored Highland tradition of stealing cattle. Or, I'm sorry, strategically transferring someone else's cattle to a different location. Yeah. Of course, you gotta mention the Loch Ness Monster. And I do they mention that, the guide mentions that some people think that the loch is bottomless. And I did read that Diana has basically kind of confirmed in theory that the Loch Ness Monster is actually a dinosaur. That underneath the loch there is a standing stone or whatever, standing circle, and that the Loch Ness Monster is a dinosaur from prehistoric times. I'm pretty sure she kind of confirmed that, which I think is cool. I think I read somewhere that. I could be wrong. They go back to Mrs. Baird's, and they finally mention the Standing Stones. And of course, Frank mentions that Reverend Wakefield mentioned witches, or druids, so he wants to get there early enough to see them. So they get there early enough to see the druids. They do this Standing Stone, they watch them, do their druid dance or whatever. Frank wants to investigate more, but, one of the druids kind of stays back, lights a cigarette. So they leave because they don't really want to get caught or be a bother or whatever. But Claire wants to go back because she saw a plant that she noticed and she wants to basically see and get and press. Well, Frank asked her to check if they did some burnings, as fire is very related to Beltane, which I'm pretty sure they were dancing for. And I do love that Frank kind of went into a tangent about the dance in the singing. If it was old, if it had roots in ancient Norse, and if the dancing had something different. So she goes back and she does a cursory glance, but it's if there was a fire, someone went to great pains to hide it. And it's also raining, so, you know, she just wants to get her plant and go. But then the stones start screaming. She says it's sounds of battle, horses dying and men dying or whatever. It's horrifying. She, you know, kind of gets into a trance, so to say. And she mentions that once she fell asleep in the passenger of a car, and when she woke up after a sudden stop to see headlights, that was the only feeling that could kind of describe what she's going through, kind of. So she basically kind of walks towards the stone, and then she finally escapes, but and the stones are now silent, and she hears not the sounds of the stones' battles and dying, but the regular sounds of human arguments. And that's how the chapter ends. What I loved about this chapter is that the author was very good at describing what's around. I kind of felt like I could place myself in the scenes very easily. Like, I could picture myself sitting in Reverend Wakefield's office, kind of watching them pore over their dusty papers and whatnot. Or I could picture myself sitting at the table with Miss Graham and Claire drinking tea. And I could picture myself just watching the druids dance. She was very good at capturing what she was writing. I do love Claire. She has kind of a subtle, sarcastic, and witty sense about her. That's kind of not... And I just love that Frank is such a history buff. I love history, but as well, so you know. I do love their conversation they had about, you know, children and adoption. Overall, I really enjoyed this chapter. It was a nice chapter. Very entertaining. I do kind of wish it wasn't as long, though. It was 25 pages, or at least the book I have, it was 25 pages worth. Or 26, I think. And I kind of felt like maybe the Loch Ness stuff and the stuff with the vicar could have been in a different... it does... No, it all fits in the same chapter. It's just kind of like... When I was reading, I didn't check how many pages there were until I got to the end, and I was like, damn, 25 pages. And that's the only complaint, which is not a bad thing. Oh no, my book has, my chapter has too many pages of good writing. Yeah, that's the worst complaint. I'm going to give this chapter an 8 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. Leave a like, comment, subscribe if you want, and I'll see you in the next video.